The Indian Act is awful. It creates Indian reserves in Canada, racial enclaves really, and it treats Indians there as second-class citizens. It gives them fewer rights than the rest of us have. It was literally the model studied by South Africa when they set up their apartheid laws. Apartheid is gone, thankfully, in part due to Canadian pressure. But our own Indian laws remain. I hate that. But a little later I'm going to show you who loves that. Now, Stephen Harper wants to change that. He hasn't proposed doing away with Indian reserves altogether. He has simply mused about giving Indians who live there property rights, instead of having all the land and property owned communally by the government, called the Indian Band, and controlled by Indian politicians, called chiefs. Let me take just 1 second on that before moving on. I mean, we use words like Indian bands and Indian chiefs, and it sounds a little exotic, or at least cultural, I guess, especially when those chiefs wear traditional outfits and beautiful headdresses. Here's Assembly of First Nations Grand Chief Sean Atleo in his full regalia. But this stops us from looking at these people for who they are. And it's a problem because so many journalists and commentators who are normally very tough and inquisitive and skeptical about challenging governments called City Hall or Parliament and taking on politicians called Mayor or Prime Minister, all of a sudden get very nervous about criticizing politicians and governments called Indian chiefs and Indian bands, especially if they're dressed traditionally, as if these politicians are suddenly some sort of religious leader, like a priest or a rabbi or a pope, who of course themselves ought to be subject to scrutiny and criticism too. But when a government is called an Indian band and a politician is called an Indian chief, people are too often afraid to be skeptical or critical because they're nervous about being called racist. Okay, back to Harper. He wants to give basic rights to Indians that the rest of us have, especially the key right of any human being, property rights, the building block right, the strategic right upon which so many of our other rights are based. I mean, how can you protect your home if you don't have the right to own a home? How can you build a business if you don't have the right to the land your business is on? Don't have the right to even get a mortgage or even a car lease? Don't have the right to sell the fruits of your labor or the produce of your own farm? You're not going to believe who likes these racist rules, but I'll tell you about that later. Anyways, let me give you a quick refresher on just how awful the lack of property rights is for an ordinary Indian family living on reserve. Section 20 of the Indian Act says, and I quote, "No Indian is lawfully in possession of land in a reserve unless, with the approval of the minister, possession of the land has been allotted to him by the council of the band." That's nuts! You can't own land unless you get a politician's approval, and then that has to be approved by the Minister of Indian Affairs out in Ottawa. It's crazy. You can't own a house, an apartment, a condo, a backyard, a shop, a store, nothing. It's all owned by the government. You can't even own a farm. But even if you manage to somehow work on a farm as a farmer, you still can't sell what you grow to anyone who's not also living on the reserve. If you have a gorgeous wheat field near Calgary or a ranch near Saskatoon, you are still not allowed to sell what you grow to those two cities. I'm not kidding. Here's the law. It's Section 32 of the Indian Act, and I quote, "A transaction of any kind whereby a band or a member purports to sell, barter, exchange, give, or otherwise dispose of cattle or other animals, grain or hay, whether wild or cultivated, or root crops or plants, or their products from a reserve in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, to a person other than a member of that band is void." Can you believe it? I mean, you need permission in writing to get around it. Sorry, that's just racist. It's anti-industry, anti-economy, anti-wealth, anti-jobs, anti-food, anti-everything. It's anti-property rights, but most of all, it's racist because this stupid law only applies to Indians living on reserves. I studied apartheid laws in South Africa, and I couldn't find an equivalently stupid law even there. Okay, just one more. Section 89. This law talks about what the law calls personal property, which means things like cars or trucks or boats. Listen. Subject to this act, the real and personal property of an Indian or a band situated on a reserve is not subject to charge, pledge, mortgage, attachments, levy, seizure, distress, or execution in favor or at the instance of any person other than an Indian or a band. So what that means is you can't get a car loan or a lease. Because when you or I do that, we sign a contract saying that if we don't pay our lease payments, the car company can come and take the car back. I mean, fair enough. But that's not allowed on an Indian reserve because we don't want Indians subject to unscrupulous car dealers, I guess. But that means that if an Indian doesn't have cash, he can't buy anything. Imagine if you and I had to live without credit, without mortgages, without loans, without car leases, all because some stupid racial law says we are too stupid to fend for ourselves against the big banks. Okay, just one last quote, I promise, and then I'll go back to what Harper's doing. Okay, Section 46 of the Indian Act doesn't just limit what Indians can do with their property when they're alive. It tells Indians what they can and can't do with their property even after they die. Get this, Section 46. The minister may declare the will of an Indian to be void in whole or in part if he is satisfied that the will purports to dispose of land in a reserve in a manner contrary to the interest of the band. So even after you're dead, a political cabinet minister in Ottawa who knows nothing about you or your family has the right to crack open your last will and testament and change it if for some political reason he thinks it's in the interest of the local band government for him to do it. Again, band's just the code for Indian government. So even in death, Indians on reserve don't get any dignity. Look, it's not just the immorality of denying Indians this basic human right called property. It's the disastrous results in the community, the poverty, the unemployment, a dozen social ills ranging from drug and alcohol use to crime and even suicide. So Stephen Harper proposes to take a baby step of giving Indians rights to their own property. I mean, he hasn't even introduced a bill in Parliament yet, but he's sending out trial balloons. Oh, you wouldn't believe the opposition to giving Indians property rights. I'm actually shocked. So who are these racists? Who are these people who would deny Indians the same rights that you and I enjoy? Are they some sort of, I don't know, white supremacist group who thinks that Indians don't deserve to be equal under our law? Oh, I don't know, maybe it's some condescending, rich, white, liberal professor, sorry, I repeat myself, who thinks that out of noblesse oblige, we have to protect Indians from themselves as if they were children. We protect children from doing risky things, right? I mean, we'd never let a child sign a mortgage or a child engage in commerce with sharp-dealing banks, right? So surely we ought to protect the Indians for the same reason. I mean, we don't want them selling the Rocky Mountains to some unscrupulous developer for $24 worth of beads, do we? Look, I hate liberals like that who want to hug minorities so hard that they end up suffocating them. It's a soft form of bigotry, the bigotry of low expectations, that thinks that other races or cultures couldn't survive in freedom, so we've got to nanny them to death. That's actually the working theory of the Indian Act. Ordinary Indians can't be trusted to engage in commerce with white folks, so it all has to be done by Indian politicians, and all of that has to be overseen by Ottawa bureaucrats. So back to the question, who's against these reforms? Who's against Harper's idea of giving Indians property rights? The answer will shock you. I will show you who after the break. You don't want to miss this. So are we all agree that the Indian Act is racist? I mean, even saying the words the Indian Act is creepy. We'd never accept a law that segregates any other group of people by race or religion. Well, not never. I guess we've done that in the past with the Chinese head tax and interning Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. But those weren't our country's proudest moments. We believe in equality before the law. We believe in treating individuals as individuals and giving each of us rights on that basis, not as part of some larger ant colony in which we're just a part. So we've got this law called the Indian Act that treats Indians like children. It doesn't let them make key decisions in their own lives, decisions about their homes and farms and businesses and vehicles, even their own wills. It's racist, but worse, it's racist in a condescending, you're too stupid to live without adult supervision kind of way. And the supervision it applies comes from Ottawa in the form of the Indian Affairs Department and the minister, but it also comes from a massive Indian industry. Remember, it's not just the cabinet minister in Ottawa who has the power over Indians. It's the local bands and chiefs, what you and I would call mayors and aldermen. And as we've shown you, that whole Indian industry is extremely well paid. Here, for example, is the payroll sheet for the Attawapiskat Indian Band in Northern Ontario. It's got about 500 families together in this little town, smaller than my high school was. But it has 3 chiefs on the payroll, 18 band counselors, plus a full-time staff of bureaucrats. This is a payroll. These are the folks with so much money, they blew 96 grand on a new Zamboni right in the middle of their housing crisis. I mean, that's the Indian industry, the 1%ers who make an enormous income off the Indian Act, including lots of Indians. I've told you about the Indian Millionaires Club, called the Assembly of First Nations. We've shown you how about 100 Indian chiefs and other politicians get paid more than Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of all of Canada, and how one chief actually gets paid over $900,000 a year. Remember, that's all tax-free. And not just folks on reserve, so many Indian experts and consultants and professors and bureaucrats get their cut of the Indian industry action too. It's very lucrative. Again, just for the 1%ers at the top, life for ordinary Indians on reserve is awful. Poverty, social failure. But for the 1%ers, they love it. In a way, they've taken over as the enslavers of Indian people. I don't think most white Canadians think of ourselves as masters or colonizers of Indians. We're on their side. We sympathize with their grief and want to help. I think the ones who are now the bosses, the new imperialists, the new settlers, the new colonialists, certainly the new bosses, the ones implementing this Indian Act, many of them are Indian themselves. This is not a bare opinion. Read the Indian Act. Besides the minister in Ottawa, enormous power over the lives of regular Indians rests in the hands of Indian politicians called chiefs. That's what I'm saying. Ironically, perversely, today's Indian chiefs are the new colonists. They're the new exploiters. They're certainly the ones with the power over their fellow Indians. It's right there in the law. So, and this is what I've been hinting at for about 10 minutes now, it's those very same Indian chiefs, the Indian one percenters, who are the most vocal against reforming the Indian Act. They're the ones with the most to lose. It's not white settlers or explorers or colonists or rogue traders with the Hudson's Bay Company trying to get a few extra beaver pelts who are against Indians today. I doubt there's a bank in Canada that would risk the PR disaster if they were caught taking advantage of an Indian. No, the only people who want to keep Indians down and want to deny them their property rights are the 1%ers who love the system just the way it is. Thank you very much. And oh, by the way, if you happen to challenge them, you'll be called a racist, so better not do it. These are the people who are dead set against giving ordinary Indians property rights, because right now, it's these people who control the property. If you're taking power away from the Indian industry, away from the chiefs and giving it to ordinary Indians, of course the chiefs are going to oppose you. Take this Indian politician named Pam Palmater. She came in second at the recent election for the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. She got 141 votes to Sean Atleo's 341. So she's a total Indian industry insider. She's a perfect case of an Indian 1%er. She used to work at the Federal Department of Indian Affairs as a director. She's a law professor now, so she earns six-figure money. She'd be a 1%er in white Canada, let alone on any Indian reserve. But she's viciously against the idea to give ordinary Indians their property rights. Here's what she says, quote, "This act is essentially a big oil and mineral land grab. This contemplated legislation isn't in any stretch of the imagination for our own benefit." She's talking about Stephen Harper's idea. Huh? The property rights in Harper's idea would go to Indians. If there's a grab here, it's a grab by Indians grabbing their property from Indian chiefs. How's that bad? Some Indian land does have minerals on it, some doesn't. It's great if it does, because that means some ordinary Indians are going to get rich instead of just the fancy chiefs. Then Palmater said this, quote, "We know exactly what conservative code word means, and unlocking economic potential means unprotecting. That's the whole purpose of this. Canadians don't have constitutionally protected lands. We do," unquote. Unprotecting? Unprotecting from whom, by whom? Fancy Pam Palmater wants to protect her fellow Indians from themselves. She doesn't trust them to their own lands. God forbid they should develop their land like other Canadians are allowed to. God forbid they should be able to own an apartment or a farm or get a mortgage. But Palmater wants to protect them from a free market economy. She wants the Indian industry to stay in charge of the little people. Of course she does, because she wants the fruits of the free market herself. She wants the wealth and comfort and choice that comes with the free market herself, but not for other Indians. See, about that. Where exactly does this six-figure earning 1%er Pam Palmater live herself? What's her home like on reserve? Is it leaky like those on Anawapiskat? No, she doesn't live on an ethnic Bantustan. She's not on a reserve. That's for the little people. She lives in Ajax, Ontario. Her address is shown right here, private property. She can own it, improve it, sell it, mortgage it, whatever. She's happy to enjoy property rights for herself. But for normal Indians, not the 1%ers, not the politicians, they have to live in communal housing, that is, in slums. So she's a hypocrite. What politician isn't? But that's the thing. Call yourself a chief or a band member, refer to your ancient spiritual customs, and all of a sudden Canadian journalists get very sentimental and shy and submissive and don't subject you to the scrutiny that they would white politicians. For example, they don't do some basic digging to show what a political extremist you might be. Like about 10 seconds on Google to find out just what a whack job Pam Palmater is, the woman who would deny her fellow Indians the property rights that she enjoys in her own house. The woman who came in second as Grand Chief. Here's a clip of her going just full nut bar. Look at this.
They think that genocide is something that's a purposeful act. Well, purposefully standing by while our women go murdered and missing is just as much genocide as taking our women and killing them in residential. They still steal our babies. Look at Child and Family Services. They continue to try to force our hearts on the ground to defeat our nations. But we're all here as a testament to say they will never do that to us.
Seriously, this wacko is accusing white politicians of purposefully ignoring the murders of Aboriginal women and then calls residential schools a genocide. Look, there's no genocide in Canada. In a genocide, which literally means to murder everyone with a certain genetic makeup, in a genocide, there aren't millionaire Indian chiefs who don't have to pay tax. In a genocide, you don't have one percenters like Paul Mater, who are basically official Indians for a living. A genocide is what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, or what happened to the Armenians or Turkey, places like that. Sorry, Canadian residential schools, for all their problems, were not a genocide. But the nutty part followed that. She said that social services, and I quote, still steal our babies as a plan to defeat our nations. She's saying that social services in Canada are a sly way that white folks wage war on Indians and kidnap them? Sorry, that's just as crazy as a 9/11 truther or some other conspiracy theorist. If it were a white politician saying that, we'd laugh her off the stage. But she's quoted piously by reporters. She came in second at the Grand Chief. Well, you notice all those flags there. Those were Mohawk Warriors flags. Anyways, let me quote you a few more quotes from Pam Palmater. Here's her response to the Conservatives trying to increase Aboriginal employment, including encouraging Indians to go into the lucrative field of mining. Here's what she said, quote, "I am always struck when the Conservatives are able to convince the public that the source of the serious housing, water, and poverty crisis in First Nations is simply because we don't have jobs," unquote. Yeah, God forbid an Indian gets a job, a well-paying job in the private sector, as opposed to being a perpetual Indian industry tax sucker like Paul Mater. But this last one really takes the case. Here's Paul Mater writing about Stephen Harper, the man who wants to give Indians their own property rights. Quote, "If you ask me, the real radical terrorists are the new Conservative Party," unquote. Now, Pam Palmater is just one of hundreds of Indian industry one-percenters. But she's a leader, had 101 votes, peeled off of Atleo and gone her way. She'd be the big chief today. She is quoted lovingly in the media. She's a professor. She used to work in the Indian Affairs Department, but she's nutty as a Snickers bar. She's a conspiracy theorist. She calls Harper a terrorist. Now, that's all about who she is as a politician, which you would never know if you just read the media party, because they don't ask tough questions or do any skeptical research into Indian industry one-percenters, because that would be racist. But even if she wasn't a conspiracy theorist, even if she wasn't so wacky, she's still an enemy of her own people. Never forget that. Never forget that the people most supportive of our Canadian apartheid are the Indian chiefs and councils and all of their hangers-on. Never forget that. After a century of gaming the system, there are plenty of people getting rich off the Indian Act. Not most Indians, not normal Indians, not average Indians. They're still living in squalor. But the fancy ones, the ones living in a house just outside Toronto, working at a white man's university, cashing the white man's check and working the white man's guilt, they're doing just fine. Hey, Stephen Harper, stop this apartheid. Ignore the noisy extremists who profit from the Indian Act. Ignore them. They have a vested interest in keeping power away from ordinary Indians. Listen to the voiceless, the powerless, the poor. Give them the tools to take their lives back. The right to own their own home and land and farm and property. Don't worry about Pam Palmater. She'll always find some way to get rich off the white man's guilt. Worry about the 99% of Indians who aren't millionaires and who desperately need your help.